Thank you so much, Stephen and Rosemary. I'm really excited to be here with you today to talk about rebuilding credit and increasing financial stability. Just a quick note to start off, since we will be talking about debt and collections a little bit, which are issues that may have legal implications. I just want to point out that our presentation is really focused on best practices around debt management and credit building, but nothing in this presentation is meant to be taken as legal advice at all. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, I just wanted to review briefly the agenda for our presentation today. I am going to do just a brief introduction to Credit Builders Alliance and our thoughts on why credit is so important in this day and age. And then we'll dive into really the meat of the presentation in discussing the differences and intersections between debt and credit building. We'll also talk more specifically about strategies that you and your clients can take to address errors and identity theft, prioritize and manage debts and collections, and then finally we'll wrap up with some general kind of do's and don'ts, best practices around rebuilding credit. So just so you know who we are, Credit Builders Alliance was created by and for our nonprofit members in response to the need for low and moderate income individuals, many of whom comprise the millions of Americans with no or thin credit files, to gain or regain access to the modern financial system by building credit and financial access. Our philosophy is that a good credit file is essential to achieving and maintaining financial stability. And it's our belief that mission-driven nonprofits and other organizations such as governmental institutions and municipal entities are really well positioned to help individuals and families build credit as an asset and often as the foundational asset necessary to get and stay ahead. So we provide an array of technical services and training to almost 500 nonprofit and governmental agencies across the country. So that is Credit Builders Alliance in a snapshot. So again, we just really like to start out any conversation about credit and talking about how important credit is. And one of the good analogies that we have about that is that credit is really like a passport to the new economy. So as that passport, credit really now touches many, many aspects of our lives. Of course, good credit equals access to high quality financial products. Many of us require access to credit for emergencies, and sometimes without credit, it's possible to depend on predatory lending and fall into a cycle of over-indebtedness. In addition to just basic access to financial products, having good credit helps us find more affordable financial products, including loans for things like assistive technology. Good credit also equals opportunity and options for housing. Many landlords pull credit reports to determine whether to rent to an applicant and sometimes how much of a security deposit that they might charge. Good credit can reduce or eliminate costly deposits otherwise required to turn on utilities or acquire a cell phone contract. In addition, a positive credit rating may also reduce the cost of products like car and homeowners insurance. However, California does have some limitations around the use of credit scores for determining insurance premiums. So that's a good thing in that department. And finally, good credit equals asset building. So a good credit history can really make the difference in accessing the affordable lending products that are necessary to go to college, to buy a home, or to start and grow a small business. And if you attended the webinar that we provided for this network in January, you'll remember that really the only way to establish and sustain a good credit score is through the responsible use of active credit, or credit building as we call it. So to build credit, you must be making on-time payments that are reported each month to a credit bureau. And again, it's not enough to just have a past history of responsible credit use or even accounts that you have open. You really actually have to continue to actively use loans and credit cards in order to support a healthy credit score. However, in addition to supporting strong credit scores through on-time payments on current credit accounts, we know that many people are struggling with poor or low credit scores that may come as a result of past issues or challenges or unexpected events that has led to outstanding debt and other credit issues. And so that is really going to be the focus of today's webinar. So if you are looking to rebuild a poor credit history, or working with a client that has poor credit history, really the very first step that you must take is to thoroughly review your credit report. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time today to go into the details of how to read and understand credit reports. But you can access a copy of your credit report for free from each of the 3 major credit bureaus by visiting www.annualcreditreport.com. And while each of the 3 bureaus, Equifax, TransUnion, and Experian, do have slightly different formats, the information that's included in the credit report is similar across those bureaus. And you should be able to find additional information on the Bureau's websites about how to read those particular reports. And again, there's lots of other resources that are out there about how to read a credit report. But for the purposes of rebuilding credit, in a nutshell, it can be really helpful to review the report in detail and think about making an inventory of what you find, including the good stuff, so accounts that have a positive status and celebrating that. Then also accounts that may have a negative history but could have the potential to be positive that could be brought current. So an example of that would be maybe a credit card account that is in a delinquent status but is in a delinquent status by, let's say, 30 days. And then of course we also want to make a list of negative items, including charged off debts, collection accounts, and public records. And finally, we want to make a separate list of the items that you or your client determine are not correct. Breaking down the credit report into these components can be really helpful in creating a clearer picture of your credit profile and the different strategies that you might take towards resolving the issues in these distinct categories. It also may be helpful to offer an opportunity to recognize and celebrate that there are positive things on the credit report or accounts that could be brought into that positive status. We know that credit and credit reports can be overwhelming, so sometimes this step, really breaking the report down into more bite-sized pieces, can be the most challenging initially, but the most fundamental piece of helping us feel more in control of our credit. And I did notice that there was a question that came in, and that question was, what is the most effective and efficient way to challenge an item on the credit report? And we will discuss that a little bit later. I've got a couple of slides on disputing inaccurate information, so we'll make sure and circle back to ensure that your question was answered. Okay. So of course, when we talk about rebuilding credit, we're oftentimes thinking a lot about debt. And debt, of course, is a critical piece of the puzzle in managing strong credit history. But it's also important to understand that managing active debt, repaying active debt, while it can definitely improve the score, it's not a credit building strategy in and of itself. So first, there has to be something to manage, and second, there has to be that ongoing on-time payment really to sustain credit building. So just to provide you with an example, if you are working with somebody who's struggling with large amounts of credit card debt, let's say, or even small amounts, you may start out with working with them to create a budget and gradually pay those debts off over time. And this will generally have a positive impact on the credit score during that repayment. If, however, once those debts are fully paid, the person ceases to use those credit cards or it closes the accounts, their credit score could eventually drop and even disappear if they do not have any other active credit accounts. So again, in order to build and sustain credit over time, it's important to have those active accounts. Sometimes debt and credit building debt management and credit building go together, and sometimes they are, have slightly different objectives. So now that we know a little bit more about, we've thought a little bit more about the intersections between debt management and credit building, we can start thinking about how to approach debt from a credit building perspective. And when I say a credit building perspective, I'm saying that we want to address the debt issues to help somebody achieve financial stability in that they are reducing their monthly costs. They don't have as much of a debt burden on their shoulders. But we also want to think about that credit building perspective in that this person might have other goals that they're trying to achieve that a positive credit score would help them. So again, it's not just paying off that debt, but it's also thinking about how to improve and sustain a good credit score over time so that you can achieve the goals that you're looking for, such as securing housing or asset building opportunities, small business ownership, and all of those things. So in the coming slides, I'm going to talk about these 4 distinct strategies. One is tackle low-hanging fruit. So take care of those easy to address items first. We're going to talk about how we might think about prioritizing debt payments based on both credit score improvement and financial stability. We'll talk about weighing the costs and benefits of paying debt and collection. And we'll finally talk about navigating competing priorities that somebody might have around making decisions around debt. Okay, so the first strategy that I want to talk about is tackling the low-hanging fruit. So again, if you haven't seen your credit report in a long time, or you're working with somebody who hasn't seen their credit report in a long time, it can really be overwhelming to kind of open that up and face whatever is on there. So a really good starting strategy is to look for those easy wins and things that you can see immediate progress from achieving. So the very first of those is to dispute any errors or inaccuracies that appear on the credit report. And this is important from an identity protection standpoint, as well as to make sure that inaccurate information is not negatively affecting the credit score. So you might see information on your credit report that is not correct, such as names that you don't recognize or addresses. And while it might not be impacting the credit score, it could be a sign that information, your personal information, is out there and somebody else is attempting to use it. So you definitely want to take the steps to address that and do a little bit more research to see if your identity has in fact been compromised. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Another strategy for tackling those low-hanging fruits is to get delinquent accounts current. And that's a great way to turn potentially bad debt into healthy active credit. So again, if you think about the example of having a credit card where you've maybe fallen a little bit behind, you've missed one payment, so you're a month behind on that, that late payment will continue to affect your credit score once you bring the account current. However, the negative effect that it has will diminish over time as you continue to make on-time payments. So basically, the farther away you get from a late payment on an active credit account, the more the less that late payment will have on this effect that will have on your credit score. And again, we're thinking about current accounts, so we're thinking about open loans and credit cards and things like that. For collection accounts, those can never actually really be in the positive status, but we're thinking about those open active accounts that even if you've had a little bit of a negative history in the past, if you can get them back into that current status and continue to make those payments on time, it will have a great impact on the score. It's something you want to definitely hang on to rather than letting it go further into a delinquent status. And then finally, anytime you can pay debts down but keep them active can also help reduce credit utilization, so the amount that you owe on credit accounts, and that will benefit the credit score also in a positive way. Okay, so just going back a little bit to talking about disputing errors and inaccuracies, we could do a whole webinar on just that topic. So I'll just give you a little bit of information that can be helpful. So the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is a really great resource for finding customizable dispute letters and also lots of other great pieces of information on how to dispute inaccurate information, or even how to get a debt validation. So let's say you find something on your credit report that doesn't look familiar, but you're not completely sure what it is or who the creditor is. You can also go on consumerfinance.gov and find templates for debt validation letters, which is a letter that you'd send to a creditor to request more information about your account. Now once you discover that yes, this is in fact an error, whether the entire account is an error or there's an error in what has been reported, or maybe even you just have address reported that's not yours, you can access dispute letters from the CFPB, and they've got lots of different templates that are really easy to download and use and plug in your information to send those to the creditors and credit bureaus. So a dispute letter is just basically going to say, I checked my report, I found that this information is inaccurate, and it's inaccurate because it's not my information, or this is reported incorrectly, whatever your reason is. In addition to that basic letter, it's really helpful to send some additional items with a dispute letter, including a copy of the report that you identified the dispute on, with those items that are incorrect highlighted or circled. You also want to include any proof that you might have of anything that you're disputing. Just any kind of documentation that would support the fact that you're claiming that this is not your information, or this is not your account, or something has been reported incorrectly. If the information that you are disputing is the result of identity theft, then you would also want to include the identity theft report, which is a combination of an identity theft affidavit and police report. And I've got another slide coming up that will talk about what those items are. When you're disputing items on your credit report, the most comprehensive approach is to dispute with both the credit bureau that is reporting the inaccurate information, as well as with the creditors directly if you're disputing an inaccurate account. And both of these entities have requirements for how they must handle disputes. So when you dispute with the credit bureau, you will submit all that information that I just covered, and what the credit bureaus do is they actually communicate with the creditor if it's an account, and they require that the creditor responds or investigates and responds to the dispute, either saying, no, that's not correct, or yes, that is correct. The credit bureaus typically respond and resolve the disputes within 30 to 45 days. They must send you a response, at least a response within 30 days from the date of the dispute, that they received the dispute. But sometimes they ask a question, or they need more information, and it can take a little bit more time to be further resolved. However, they must respond to you initially within 30 days. If your dispute is successful and there's a change to your credit report as a result, then you are able to access an additional copy of that credit report to ensure that that change has been made. And then finally, when you're disputing with the credit bureaus, you also have an opportunity to add a statement if the issue is not resolved as you wished. However, you just want to not abuse that option, because it's important to know that any entity that would access your credit report would see that statement. So that would be really in kind of extreme cases if you decided that you wanted to add a statement to your credit report. Creditors also have requirements in terms of how they need to respond to consumer disputes. Again, they are required to investigate and respond to a consumer within 30 days. If you dispute with the creditor directly, they are required to also notify the bureaus to which they report information. And so the most comprehensive, of course, is to dispute with both of the credit bureaus and the creditors directly. You can do one or the other, but if you want to kind of cover all your bases, that's the most comprehensive approach to going forward. Okay. If you've experienced identity theft or you think you might be at risk for identity theft, this means that somebody has either used an account that you currently have, so let's say a bank account or a credit card account, if that has been misused by somebody that's not you without your permission, that is identity theft, in addition to if somebody stole your personal information, which would include things like your name, your date of birth, your address, your social security number, any kind of personal identifying information that you have. If somebody took that information and used it to try to open an account, that is also identity theft. And you might identify through the credit report that your identity has been compromised, or you might find that out through other means, such as looking at your bank account statement and seeing charges that you don't recognize, or looking at your credit card statement, or getting strange mail that's come that says you've opened new accounts. If you get any indication that your identity might have been stolen and you haven't pulled your credit report, that's definitely a next best step to do so. And again, this is a huge topic. We could spend all day talking just about identity theft, but a really good starting place if you think that your identity has been compromised or you're working with a client who's experienced this is to just go straight to the www.identitytheft.gov, which is managed by the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, and they have a very straightforward website where you can kind of walk through, they ask you questions, you input information, and they will, if you've been a victim of identity theft, that system will help you create what's called an identity theft affidavit that you can then take and get a police report as well, and the combination of those two items created an identity theft report. So that's a great resource that you can check out if you have experienced identity theft. All right. So moving forward, we're going to talk a little bit more about going back to debt management and how we might think about prioritizing debts with credit building in mind. So when you and your client or your clients have a lot of outstanding debts and then limited resources, it can be really difficult to make decisions about which debts should be prioritized. And this is especially true when debt collectors are really putting the pressure on with phone calls and collection notices. We might have the initial instinct to kind of grease the squeaky wheel and to try to keep those collectors at bay. However, I think it's really important to take a step back and think about what these priorities are, and what your priorities are, and how your financial stability and credit building goals impact the decisions that you make around debt. So there's some different factors that you might want to consider in how you prioritize different debts. And it's important to note that these might be different for different people and different situations, and people that have different goals. So somebody who is really trying to access rental housing in the very near future versus somebody who's looking at homeownership in 5 years or so. Those different priorities might really inform how they address their debt issues just slightly differently. But some of those factors that we might consider first are prioritizing accounts that have the potential to become current, or at a minimum preventing active delinquent accounts from being turned over to a collection agency or becoming a civil judgment and ultimately a wage garnishment. So it's thinking about how to prioritize those debts based on keeping debts from getting into a worse status that could have more of a negative impact on either the credit score or our financial stability, such as an example of like some kind of a garnishment or judgment that would be more serious than a charged off account, for example. In addition, another thing to consider in how to prioritize debts might be the original delinquency date for derogatory accounts and when that item will come off the report. So we'll talk about that a little bit in the next slide. But basically, accounts on your credit report and negative activity on your credit report stays on the credit report for a set period of time, and that time limit is based on the date of, or the original date of delinquency, which is the date that that account first went into a negative status based on a payment that was more than 30 days late. And finally, you might want to think about prioritizing your debt based on taking into account the size of debts and what types of interest rates are being charged. So a debt that has a really high interest rate that is maybe even compounding every month, so the amount owed is growing and growing and growing, might be one for some folks that they want to kind of bring to the forefront and try to take care of that first, since it is, maybe the balance is growing at a rapid rate. Just going back to that idea of the original delinquency date, how long does information stay on your credit report? So if you have open accounts that are in good standing, so let's say we have a credit card and we are using it, paying it on time, as long as that credit card is open and active, it will stay on your credit report indefinitely. If you have a closed account that was closed in good standing, so let's say you had an auto loan and it was a 5-year term, and following the 5 years you'd made all your payments on time, that account will stay on the credit report for 10 years from the date that it was closed. So you get the benefit of a little bit more time for those positive accounts. If you have late or missed payments on a current credit account, that negative information will stay on the report 7 years from the date of first delinquency. So let's say I have a credit card account that's open, and I'm making all my payments on time, and then one month I go out of town and I totally space making the payment. The payment is, let's say my payment, when I finally make it, it's actually 30 days late. Then I would get a negative mark on my credit report, and then let's say I recover, I start making all my payments on time again, and I never have any other late payments. That one record of that late payment would stay on the credit report or impact the credit score 7 years from the date of that it was 30 days delinquent. However, the negative impact, as I mentioned earlier, would gradually reduce over time. So it would have a stronger impact when it first came up, when I was first late. But then after a couple years, my credit score would probably recover if all other things were the same. Charge-off accounts and collection accounts remain on the credit report for 7 years from that date of first delinquency. Bankruptcies, depending on the type of bankruptcies, can stay on the credit report 7 years or 10 years, depending on what type of bankruptcy they are. Civil judgments stay on the credit report 7 years from the date that they were entered into the court. Foreclosures, also 7 years. Tax liens are 7 years from the date that they're paid, or if they are outstanding, they can stay on the credit report indefinitely. And then finally, inquiries, so that would be when you apply for credit. So if you go to a credit union and you're applying for a car loan, the record of that application for credit stays on your report for 2 years. So again, that's just how long information stays on the report, and that might be something that we want to keep in mind when we're deciding how to address outstanding debts. However, the date of first delinquency, which is what dictates in the previous slide that I went through all of those different accounts and how long they stay on the credit report, that's not the same as the statute of limitations. And it's also not the same as the date the account was turned over to a collection agency or the date of last activity. So basically the date of first delinquency is set in stone. Once you are, once you don't pay an account, it goes to collections. Even if years down the road you decide to pay a creditor or make a settlement on that account, that doesn't mean it updates the date of first delinquency, and it doesn't mean that it resets the clock, so to speak, or that your account will stay on for an additional 7 years. In terms of the statute of limitations, the statute of limitations is dictated by state law, and it is in reference to the time period that a creditor has to take somebody to court for a debt. So that's fundamentally different from how long information can appear on your credit report. So somebody might think, oh, well, it's, an account came off of my credit report, so I don't owe it anymore. That's not necessarily true. You might very well still owe that debt, and there might be a creditor that could still take you to court for it. So it's just important to understand that there's that distinction, that just because it does or does not show up on your credit report doesn't really have anything to do with whether you are still legally obligated to pay that debt. I'll just pause there in case anybody has a question that they'd like to type in, because I know that that information gets a little bit dense and confusing. So I'll just take a moment. Feel free to type in any questions that you might have. Okay. So again, just to review, the date of first delinquency is what dictates how long information can stay on your credit report, but that does not necessarily mean the same thing as the statute of limitations or how long a creditor has to sue somebody for a debt. Okay, just moving forward. In thinking about how we deal with debt, we want to kind of think about the potential positive and negative consequences of addressing debt and how it will impact the credit report and the score. So in thinking about this, we might say, well, why would there be any negative consequences for paying a debt? Well, somebody might want to think about the way that they pay that debt, so weighing the difference between settling let's say settling a collection account and paying them in full. There might be a different way that those impact the credit account. So if you have, let's say, a very large credit collection account, so maybe your balance is $3,000, and you are able to work with the creditor for an agreement to settle that debt for $1,000. That might be very worth it to pay that $1,000 and save those $2,000, which maybe you could put towards other obligations. However, that account is going to show up as settled. It's not going to show up as paid in full. So the settled status will have less of will still have a more negative impact on the credit score. But if you have like a very small credit account, a collection account, let's say it's $100, if you're able to pay that one in full, you might want to do that to benefit from having that account status show paid in full versus showing settled, because that will have more of an impact on your score. So again, you have to weigh kind of those financial stability and credit implications of the decisions that you make. And I do see that there's a question, and it says, if a settlement is made, how does that affect the legal requirements to pay that debt? So a settlement that you make with a creditor, they should be agreeing that if you make whatever is the agreed upon settlement, that is taking care of your responsibility on that debt. And the important thing is that you want to get written confirmation of that it's going to show up as settled on your credit report, but what that should mean is that, yes, you paid less than you originally owed, but the creditor is agreeing that they will accept that less than full balance, and you will no longer be obligated to pay that debt. Another question, if somebody has the money to pay off a credit card, should they do that or should they put it towards a credit card with a larger balance if the interest rate is about the same? So this is really, it's going to really depend. That's kind of the answer to a lot of credit questions, is it depends. So if you have the money to pay off a credit card, there's a couple factors that you want to think about. You want to think about your credit utilization. So how much do you owe in comparison to what your limits are? And if you don't have any that are maxed out, because maxing out a credit card has a more negative effect than just having a balance. If none are maxed out, then they're going to look at your total utilization compared to your total limit. So it doesn't really make that much of a difference on which credit card you would apply that to. Unless you end up closing the account, which may or may not be the best decision based on what you're trying to achieve. And I'll talk about that in just another moment. So again, thinking about cost-benefit analysis, another thing to just be aware of is that it's possible that new activity on old debts could alert a dormant creditor that a consumer is paying debts. So if somebody has a lot of outstanding collection items, let's say, and then a creditor might be able to recognize that, like they just paid this other creditor, and so maybe they have resources now, and we might restart our collection attempts if we haven't talked to them in a while. That's possible. It's not necessarily always going to happen. And then again, a benefit is that paying down your revolving debt will definitely impact your credit utilization ratios. I have another question. It says, I understand that the amount that is not paid on in a settlement is taxable. Example, the original principal is $3,000. The settled amount is $1,000, and $2,000 is taxable. Is that accurate? So there is a potential for unpaid amounts to be taxable. However, that is definitely getting into a little bit more legal territory, and so I'm going to, I would recommend that if you have a client that is concerned about the tax implications of settling an account, it would be a great opportunity to get some pro bono legal advice and some advice from a tax expert in terms of understanding how exactly that would impact that person. What is the impact, another question, what is the impact in the credit score when paying a debt by borrowing from another financial institution to pay that debt? So it's going to really, it depends again. So if you are basically borrowing from one creditor to pay off another debt, there's a lot of different ways that it can impact your credit score, and it may be, it might be a good decision for one person, it might not be a good decision for another person. I think some of the things that you want to consider would be, are you able to consolidate debt and get a lower interest rate that impacts like the overall financial stability and somebody being able to meet those debt obligations? And if so, that could be a really good thing especially on the financial stability piece. For the credit implications on the credit score, it really depends on how many accounts that person has open and what their starting credit profile is. And there's really not one way that would affect everybody in the same way. So moving on again and thinking about how we deal with debt, we want to think about how we navigate competing priorities. So we don't necessarily want to open new accounts to build credit if we can bring older accounts current instead. So in the training that we did in January, we talked about how having new active credit accounts can be really good for the credit score and can really help people with no credit history or thin credit history to build a good score. However, if you already have an open credit card account that you could just start using, you don't necessarily need to open a new account. You could just start using that other account. Or let's say you have a credit account that is, like we were talking about earlier, maybe just a month or two behind. We don't want to open a new account and start having positive behavior on a new account when we have something else that we can actually get into that current status. It's also encouraged to avoid closing open revolving accounts, and there's two main reasons for that. Again, if we're talking about if we have credit cards and we close one of them, that could actually impact the credit utilization. It also impacts the length of credit history that somebody has if that was one of their older accounts. So imagine if you have two credit cards, let's say, and each has a $500 credit limit for a total available credit of $1,000. And if one of these cards hasn't been used in a while and has a zero balance, and the other card has a balance of $250, then essentially you have $250 compared to $1,000 limit. You would have a credit utilization of 25%. If you close the other card that is unused, all of a sudden now you only have a $500 limit. And so your credit utilization, even though you haven't changed anything in terms of payment, is now at 50%. So that's going to have a negative impact on you. So the advice is to avoid closing older open accounts if you can. And then finally, we just don't want to ignore collection accounts to focus only on credit building or opening new accounts. Again, thinking about the legal implications of not paying debts, and if one of those old debts came back to bite you, that could impact your financial stability negatively, and then ultimately your credit as well. So we don't want to prioritize having a good credit score over our basic financial stability and other things that may put that at risk. Okay. So just thinking a little bit more about collection accounts. Like other negative activity, collection accounts really have the most significant impact on the credit score when they're first reported. And then after time, they get older, and as the older that they get, regardless of their status, they are going to have less and less of a negative impact on the credit score, and eventually they'll fall off. If you have new activity on a collection account, or if you pay one off, it does not mean it's going to stay on your credit report longer. It'll still fall off in the same time period. But a collection account that is paid in full, even if it's paid in full, it can still have a negative impact on the credit score because it's a collection account, and collection accounts are, by definition, always in the negative category. So even when it's paid in full, it doesn't necessarily come off the credit report. It remains there. However, it'll have less of an impact. And actually, some of the newer credit scores don't actually even weigh collection accounts with a $0 balance, though they will still appear on the credit report. Going back to our discussion about negotiating with creditors and settling accounts, if you have a lot of outstanding collections, it's really important to plan the process of working with creditors in advance. So again, making an inventory of all those debts, knowing what's out there, thinking about which ones are most important to prioritize first, creating a plan to save, and having those funds ready when it's time to call and negotiate either a settlement or a full payment with a creditor, and then calling them and being really armed with information, prepared. You don't necessarily want to share too much about what resources you have, but you also want to be firm on your budget. So if you know that you can afford to pay more than, let's say, $200 on a specific account, you want to hold firm to that, because you don't want to put yourself in a position that you wouldn't be able to meet the new obligation that you might make with a creditor. And then finally, you want to make sure that you confirm all of the details and get a written receipt for a written confirmation of the agreement that you've made, and then a written receipt for any payment that you make as well. Again, this is a topic we could do a whole nother webinar on, but that's just in the nutshell, that's kind of a process that you want to think about when you're working with creditors or when you're helping your clients go through the process. And just a summary of your rights, it's really important to understand that per the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, debt collectors may not call you before 8 a.m. or after 9 p.m. They cannot contact your work if you have told them that they are not allowed to do so. They can't contact a third party about you for any reason. So they basically can't tell anybody that you owe money. They can't harass or abuse you, and they can't lie about the amount you owe. Now, we know that there's a lot of debt collectors out there that are not necessarily abiding by these requirements. In addition, they may not use deceptive methods to collect a debt from you. So I've heard a lot of stories about people saying that they get a call that says that there's a warrant out for their arrest and, if they don't pay these debts and things like that. That is illegal. So those kinds of things you definitely want to take action. And if they don't validate your debt, if they don't provide you information about a debt that you owe that you've requested, or if they violate any of those Fair Debt Collection Practices Acts that I just went over, you can report them through the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip a couple slides that I had on some new developments in terms of debt collection practices, but I did want to point out one that might be particularly relevant and is important to point out, is that per the National Consumer Assistance Plan, which is a new settlement between the credit bureaus and several states' attorney general across the country, creditors can now have a mandatory grace period that they must abide by in terms of reporting medical collections. So if you have a medical debt, it cannot be reported until it's at least 180 days old. So this is designed to give creditors and the insurance providers the time to negotiate back and forth. So if you see any information that's been reported prematurely, you can dispute that. In addition, if anything has been paid by insurance or will be paid by insurance, then the creditors actually have to delete that account from the credit report. So you can't have a negative impact of an account that's paid through insurance. Okay. So just a couple more pieces of information about general kind of misinformation and myths that are out there. Sometimes people think that you can dispute a negative item and then it'll disappear temporarily and you can get credit approved before it repairs. This is not a recommended strategy. It's not true. It'll still show up. It'll just show up as in dispute. Another one, you don't need to dispute each mistake with each bureau. So the bureaus all share information on disputes. In addition, you don't have to write separate dispute letters for each inaccuracy. So if your name is wrong and then you have an account that you want to dispute, you don't have to write separate dispute letters for all of those things. You can put them all into one letter. And then finally, the bureaus don't have any responsibility to provide you with documentation about information that you don't recognize. It's actually the creditors themselves. So if you're not sure or you need more information about a debt, you actually need to contact the creditor themselves, not the credit bureau that's reporting the information. Okay, so just a couple things that are actually illegal and fraudulent action, and these are some of the things that credit repair companies might do is paying off collections and asking for removal. This is actually not a practice that the bureaus, the credit bureaus abide by. So if a creditor says, hey, if you pay me $100, I will delete this debt and take it completely off your credit report, that actually violates the Fair Credit Reporting Act. You also don't want to or go with a company who uses a strategy of disputing everything on the report, even if it's accurate. So if you do actually owe a debt, you don't want to dispute it just to see if it'll fall off. That is fraud. Of course, you don't want to create a new credit identity with an employer identification number, so an EIN instead of your Social Security number. That is also fraud. Or buy an authorized user position on a stranger's credit card with good payment record to boost your own score. This is another example of fraud. But these are all things that we've seen out there. So a question came in: if a consumer disputes with one credit bureau, about how long before we should see the corrections with the other bureaus? It should all happen within that 30 to 45 day period, but I would say 60 days to have before you go back and check all the other reports. And if it's not showing up on another bureau, you can redispute that. Okay, I just have 2 more slides, and I know we're right at time. But predatory credit repair, again, there's a lot of companies out there that say, we will fix your credit overnight, and they promise all kinds of things, and we really want to encourage you to tell your clients and for yourself to avoid these types of services. What they typically do is they dispute everything on the credit report, whether it's valid or not, and that is a fraudulent practice. They also often charge fees for things that you as a consumer can do yourself. So you don't need to pay anything to dispute inaccurate information on your credit report. You don't need to pay anything to negotiate a settlement with a creditor beyond the payment of the debt, but you don't need to pay for that service. So in general, what you want to avoid is anybody who promises a change. So anybody who says, we guarantee that your credit score will be increased by 50 points. There's absolutely no way to guarantee that, so that is a #1 red flag. Or that they say that they'll fix your credit or repair your credit in 30 days. Again, that's a red flag. Yes. Anybody who charges upfront for services, so takes a fee in before providing any services, or anybody who asks you to bring your own report to them, that means that the bureaus don't see them as a reputable business to sell them reports directly. If you or your clients need additional assistance and you wanted to seek out help, you would want to look for trusted nonprofit financial coaching organizations or locate certified nonprofit consumer credit counseling in your area. These services do not come with upfront fees or any of these fraudulent type of credit repair scams. So that's just like a kind of final, definitely watch out for those types of services because they are very prevalent and they definitely do target our lower income and our more vulnerable communities. So I know that we're right at the top of the hour. I don't know if anybody has any other questions. I do see one question. Are there negative impacts on the credit report, the credit score, for consolidating debt through a personal loan during the life of the loan and after the loan is paid off? So there's not necessarily negative impacts for consolidating debts as long as the new consolidation loan is going to be paid on time and managed well. That being said, it depends. It always depends on really the individual circumstances and what type of product that is. But if that's a situation that works for that individual and they might be able to benefit from like a lower interest rate and one reasonable payment, then that's great. Just make sure that the terms of that new consolidation loan are affordable and there's no potential for additional risk by taking on that potentially a larger debt. And second part of that question, what are the positive effects on the credit report for using a personal loan to pay off debt? Again, so same thing. So you might be able to benefit from having a new trade line being reported, and if it's reporting positive status, then that can definitely help improve the credit score as long as that is paid on time. If there's not time to ask these now, you can absolutely email me at programs@creditbuildersalliance.org or directly to me, which is my first name, Carmina, at creditbuildersalliance.org. Thank you all for your participation today. Great questions, and thank you to Stephen and Rosemary for having me today. It was great to be here, so thanks.